What's up everyone, Natter here. In this video, I'd like to go through a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with how we can create different DOM elements in JavaScript together. In the previous video, we looked at how we can kind of create elements, update them, add them to the DOM, and then actually even remove them from the DOM. In this video, I put together a bunch of exercises for us to get more practice with that concept, and they get progressively more complex so that we can actually kind of start to see the real value of doing it this way versus doing things like inner HTML. Let's get right to the exercises together. All right, so as with the previous exercises, I have a few exercises here kind of pre-made in comments in JavaScript files. These are all also on a GitHub link I have in the description below on these videos. You can either pause the video and kind of work through these, and I'll kind of get a bit of preamble for each of these before we actually get to trying them yourself. But once you get there, you can pause it and then try it, and then we'll go through a potential solution together. All right, so for the warm-up, what I'd like you to do is create an HTML file that has a head tag and that has a title tag in the head tag that has some text inside of it, so whatever title you want, as well as an empty body tag below the head tag, okay? Then what I want you to do is open up this kind of blank looking HTML file apart from the title in your browser and open up your DevTools alongside it. In the DevTools, I'd like you to open up the console tab and create and add an h1 tag, so a header tag, with the text my blog in blue text inside the body of the page. So remember, the body is empty to start. What I want you to do is figure out how you can actually add this h1 tag from scratch just using the DevTools into the actual DOM. Then you can actually verify that it exists visually, as well as actually look at inside the Elements tab to see if it actually shows up in the actual HTML text of the DOM itself. So give that a shot yourself, and then we'll go through an example together. Okay, so to start here, I'll just create a new file. I'll call this warmup.html. And in here, as before, I'm always just gonna have a dot type at the top. I'm gonna have my HTML in here with my head. In the head, I'm gonna have a title. Let's just say warm-up exercise for this one. And then right below the head, we have our body, and I mentioned that that's gonna be empty. Right? Nothing too fancy going on here, a pretty boring HTML page. I'm just gonna open this up in my browser. So just zoom in a bunch here, just so you can see that. I'm gonna double click my warmup.html, and there we go. So I'm gonna kind of super zoom in here on my browser. Not that it's gonna make a difference right now, but you can kind of see in the top here, there's a warm-up exercise. It might be a bit small. I'll also zoom in here as well, so we can actually see what this looks like in the Elements tab. And here we have title of warm-up exercise, which is what we have up here. Notice that the body is completely empty. There's nothing in there right now. All right, so our goal is to add an h1 tag with, I already forgot the color, what did I say? With some blue text, right? That says my blog inside of here, right here. So we want some blue text that says my blog to show up as an h1 tag. So first I'm gonna create an h1 tag in memory before adding it to the DOM. So I'm gonna say const h1 is equal to document.createElement, right? And we can pass this a tag name, and it will actually create that tag for us. So in this case, I'm going to create an h1 tag. And if we take a look at my h1, what we'll see is that it's an empty h1 tag. This is actually an object. It has a whole bunch of properties on it that we can manipulate, but notice that this is not in the DOM yet, right? So if I switch back to my Elements tab, the body is still empty, just like it was before. So now I want to add some text inside of this. So I'm going to say h1.textContent is equal to, and I'll just say my blog, just like that. And now if I look at the h1, what we'll see is it has some text inside it. Great. So next thing I want to do is make sure that it shows up blue. So I don't have a CSS file linked to this HTML file, so I'm going to just do this inline using attributes. We technically haven't actually learned styles and like all the classless stuff yet. We'll do that in the next video. So for now, I'm just going to do this directly inline as an attribute. So I'm going to say h1.setAttribute, and I'll set the style attribute to be, and for CSS to change the text color, we can say color is going to be blue, just like that. Okay, just like you would see as kind of H1 and then the curly brackets, this is inside the curly brackets to change the text color. I'm not going to get fancy with the hex code, so you can change it to any other color if you don't like blue, but we'll just go with that. That is probably my favorite color. Not this particular blue, but blue in general. Now, if we look at H1 now, what we'll see is it has this attribute of style color blue in there and then a text as well. Now, again, emphasizing it's not showing up yet in the actual DOM. This is just in memory. We want to add this to the body. So I'm going to say documents.body, which gives us a shortcut to the actual body element in the DOM. And I'm going to add this as a child. There are two ways to do this. We can kind of prepend or append. If we were to use before and after, this would actually be incorrect because we want to add it as a child of the body, not as a sibling, because the only sibling of the body in this case is actually the head tag. Okay, so I'm just going to go with append since that's usually a bit easier to understand and the more common one that we'll see. So add it to the bottom of the list of nodes here. And I want to append, my H1 tag just like that. Okay, now I'm going to count to 3 and I want you to watch what happens over here when I actually execute this code and we'll see if our H1 tag shows up. All right, 1, 2, and 3. There we go. All right, so that's pretty cool. Right, so clearly it shows up in here. And now if I highlight over this H1 that I had displayed earlier in the console, it's actually going to highlight the correct thing. If I switch over to the Elements tab, lo and behold, we see that we have our H1 tag here with my blog and then our correct style attribute as well in there. All right, it looks like it added a text node as well. I'm not actually sure where that came from. That's kind of interesting. Maybe that was actually there before from my prettier, from my code editor. But suffice to say, this is really what we added right here is this H1 tag, and it looks like it's working correctly. Hopefully that one makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 1. Okay, so this one's a bit longer. I'm going to just try to scroll down a little bit so you can kind of pause the video if you like and look at the instructions on one page. Again, this is also on the GitHub if you want to grab it from there. But for this one, what I'd like to do is, again, create an HTML file that has a head tag with a title tag with some text and then an empty body, same as before. Now, the main difference with this one is I want you to add a script tag inside the body. Okay, the script tag is going to have some code inside of it, and this is the goal for this exercise. All right, I want you to add an element that looks like this to the DOM, but inside of the script tag using the DOM API. I know that we can just add this directly to the HTML page using actual HTML, but we're practicing the DOM API so we can do this dynamically through JavaScript and the DOM API. So inside the script tag, your goal is to create this element, okay? And this element is a paragraph element that has an attribute of ID with a value of intro. It has some text inside of it, but also a nested strong tag inside of it, which is to create bolded text, and as well as more text after the strong tag. Okay. Now, this seems a little bit easier than you might expect to actually do it in practice, hence why these are exercises and important to actually get practice with. So take your time with this. It definitely is not as trivial as it might seem immediately. What you want to do once you think you have this working in the script tag is open up this file, the HTML file in your browser, and verify that it looks the correct way that you'd expect it to look, specifically having this text inside a p tag, both visually and inside the actual elements tab of your dev tools inside the DOM. Okay. Now, don't use inner HTML to do this. You could, of course, just basically copy this and set the body's inner HTML to be like this. We want to use the actual DOM APIs to do this, as I mentioned. Inner HTML has a whole bunch of issues as we covered in the inner HTML and text content video. Also, it would wipe out anything else in the DOM inside the body tag if we weren't careful with it. So really, we just want to append basically this paragraph tag element to the body to make sure it shows up just like this. Now, the hint I want to give you here is that there are different types of nodes. Right? We saw that there's element nodes, which are things that have actual element tags like this strong tag, the p tag. There's also text nodes, which are things like this, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And there's comment nodes as well, which we saw in the previous video, which in this case, there is no comments in this node at all. Okay, so give that a shot, and then let's see if we can go through it together after you try. Okay, so I'm going to create another file here. I'm going to call this exercise-1.html. And I'm actually just going to go to my warmup. I'm going to copy everything in here just so you don't have to watch me retype all this. I'm going to change this title over here to be exercise 1. And then the only difference here really is in the body, I'm going to add a script tag. Okay. So let's kind of walk through these steps. I'm going to come back in here to this exercise 1. And I'm going to copy kind of this here into my HTML just so that we can see what this would look like if we were to actually create this as our tag. Okay, so I can create comments in a script tag just like that because this is JavaScript at this point. So we need to create this paragraph. We need to give it an ID, right? Then we need to put some elements inside of it. Well, actually, we really need to put one strong element inside of it with a text content of to meet. But this is not actually an element. This is just a text node. Same with this. This is also just a text node, right? So this is actually kind of challenging. So let's start really slow and see kind of how far we can get with this. So first I'm going to start with my p tag, right? I'm going to say const p is equal to document.createElement, and I'm going to create a p tag. Okay, and I'm going to say p.setAttribute. I'm going to set the ID attribute to be intro. Right? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say document.body.append, and I'm going to append my p. All right. Now I'm going to open this inside my browser again. So exercise1.html, I'm going to double click on that, and there we go. And if I bring up my inspector and I look at my head and then look at my body, we can see that this p of ID intro is in there right now. So that's pretty good. Okay. But there's no text in here yet, which makes sense. Here's our script tag. We can see all of our text is in there as we'd expect. Okay. Let me switch back to my code here. And what we want to do now is to see how we can actually get this text inside there. Now, what we could probably do is just put some text content in to start, but I want to show you kind of from top to bottom how we can kind of do this a little bit more imperatively or kind of programmatically, just so it makes more sense if we get more practice with text nodes. So I want to see what happens if I don't do this correctly. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to say p.textContent is equal to this. I'm just going to copy this text here, right? Now, if I just did this, p.textContent is equal to hello there, nice, and then strong tag, and then to meet in there, and then you. What do you think is going to happen, right? I'm going to switch back to my browser, and I'm going to refresh the page. I'd like you to think what's going to happen if we do this, right? 1, 2, 3. And we have the actual strong tag as text, which is not what we want, right? You can see here, even in the DOM, that this is actually just text. These are not being interpreted as a strong tag. Now, inner HTML would fix this, but we want to avoid using inner HTML and see how we can do this using the actual DOM API. So let me switch back here. So we don't really want to do this. So basically what we're seeing here is we have text, then we have a strong element, then we have more text. So let's see what we can do. I'm going to say const, I'll say like text1, for example. We can call this whatever you want. Is equal to document.createTextNode. And inside of this text node, I'm going to put this text right here. Hello there, nice, and then a space. Okay. Then what I'm going to say is I'm going to add this to the actual paragraph. And I can kind of do this two ways. I can create it and add it, or I can just create them all at once and then add them in the correct order. You know, I'm actually probably just going to create them all at once, add them in correct order. You can switch these around, whichever makes more sense kind of to your brain. But let's just kind of do this all at once creation-wise, and then we'll do the appending. Then I'm going to say const strong is equal to document.createElement. And this is an element, right? This is not a text node. We want to create a strong tag. Okay, Okay, now we can set the strong tag text content to be to meet, right? Just like that, which is this part right here. So we just created this part with these 2 lines of code. Then I'm going to say const text to, because I just don't have a better name. This would probably be better to actually use proper names for. I'm going to do the same thing. I say document.create text node, and I'm going to say I want to create space and then u, just like that. Okay. So check this out. We have hello there nice as a text node, which is this part. And then we have the strong tag, which is creating an empty strong tag. Then we're setting the text content to be to meet with no spaces. Then we're doing the u as a text node again right after. So as you can imagine, what we want to do is we want to append these to the p tag, right? So I'm going to say p dot append text1. I'm just going to duplicate this line, and then I'm going to say p dot append the strong tag, and then p dot append text2. Right? So this is what I meant. We're going to create all the elements, and then we're going to append them all in the correct order. So first is this one, followed by this one, followed by this one. Now we could do creation and adding kind of in order if you want, whatever makes more sense to you. But let's just go with this just so we can see top down what's happening. Then we're appending this entire p tag, which already has these nested elements inside of it, to our body. Okay. Now I'm going to save this. I'm going to switch back to my Chrome. I'm going to refresh the page and let's see what happens. So watch what happens over here and let's see what happens here in the actual elements tab. Ready? So 1, 2, and 3. And there we go, right? Isn't that totally awesome? So we actually now have the correct nodes and elements nested inside of this p tag as actual node and element tags, right? So here we have a text node, then we have our strong node, then we have another text node. And you can see, since this is an actual strong node, the default styling applies where it gets bolded, which is pretty awesome. Definitely a tricky one, but I hope you found that one interesting. Very, very powerful stuff. All right, let's take a look at exercise 2. Okay, let's see if I can put this all on one screen. Probably not. Maybe I can, actually, you know what? I think for this one, I'd rather explain it because there's quite a lot going on, and then I'll kind of put it, scroll down a bit so that you can actually pause the video and take a look. So for this exercise, these are, again, getting a bit more challenging, so really take your time with these. For this one, I'd like you, again, create an HTML file, right, with a head tag containing the title and some text. And then an empty body tag. So same starting point as before. And then in the body, I want you to add a script tag and then add a bunch of code to it, just like we saw previously. Okay, so that part is all the same. Now here's where things get kind of interesting. Inside of the script tag, I want you to create a function that's called create paragraph that has 2 parameters, text and attributes. Okay, so it looks kind of like this. Create paragraph has 2 parameters, text and attributes. All right. Then what I want you to do is make it so that this function is going to return a paragraph HTML element, right, which is using document.createElementP, which we just saw. And it's going to preset the text content to be the text that was passed in as an argument. Then the attributes are going to be passed in as an object. And the objects are going to have keys and values, as we might expect of an object, where the key is the attribute key and the value is the attribute value, right? So for example, if we called create paragraph with hello, and then this object right here, where ID of 1, and then class, oops, I made a mistake here, class of big. Okay, what that would do is this would create a paragraph tag that looks like this, right? It would create a paragraph with an ID of 1, a class of big, and then the text content set to be hello. All right, so that is kind of interesting. So this is a function, right, that's going to return a paragraph depending on what we give it as arguments, just like any other function in JavaScript. Okay. Now, what I want you to do after you've created this function, again, this is just defining the function, right, in the function body. I want you to create at least 3 different paragraph elements using this function, and then insert them into the body like within the script tag. Okay, so inside the script tag, do like document.body.append or prepend or whichever you want to actually get these inside of there. It's probably a bit confusing. I'll probably just say, add them to the body. I think I was trying too hard, but I probably added that in there. Then, as usual, open up the browser and this HTML file and verify that when you reload the page, all of these 3 paragraphs have the correct content and attributes in them that you set. Okay, and you can even try to change these and make sure that it works as expected. So the real key here are these steps right here. Okay, creating a function that creates a paragraph, having it actually take those text and attributes and put it inside the element and return it, and then using it to create 3 of these paragraph elements to put into the DOM and append them. So give that a shot, and then we'll actually go through a potential solution together. All right, so I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to say exercise-2.html. And I'm actually just going to copy everything in exercise. Actually, I'll just do that. I'm going to get rid of all this text in here. And this is going to be exercise 2. Okay, so we have our head, title, a body, and then an empty script tag with nothing in there, where we're actually going to create this create paragraph. So I'm actually going to go back to my exercise here. I'm going to copy this as an example just so that we have it as a reference. So I'm going to put this as a comment up here. Okay, so we're going to create this function. So I can do this as an arrow function, a regular function. It doesn't really matter. I'll just go with regular function for now, just to switch things up, because I always use arrow functions. We're not actually using the actual main differences in this case at all, so it doesn't actually really matter. Okay, so create paragraph. And this is going to take some text, and this is going to take some attributes. Okay, and remember, attributes is just an object. Okay, there's nothing fancy about it, just a regular plain old JavaScript object. So what do we want to do? Well, this is going to create a paragraph. So we know that already. So I'm going to say const p is equal to document.createElement, and that's going to create a p element. Okay, and then I'm going to say p.textContent is equal to the text, right? Because I want to set the text that comes in from this function argument to be the text content of that paragraph. Okay. Now here's where things get interesting. There are going to be multiple attributes passed in potentially. Maybe there are no attributes passed in. Okay. Now technically we should be a bit defensive, and we should really make sure that there are attributes in here. One alternative we can do is we can just set this to be an empty object as a default, just in case, so that we can actually have our code not need to check if it's an object, but our users can technically pass in something that's not an object. So we really want to make sure that we're actually doing some error handling, where we're checking to make sure that attributes are actually being passed in. I'm going to skip that for this video just to keep this function really concise, so we can focus on the main logic, because we can get really carried away with the error handling if we go too down that rabbit hole. So assuming that we have a bunch of attributes, let's see how we can do this. I'm going to actually use a regular for of loop here, right? So I'm going to say for const, and I'm going to destructure the key and the value of our attribute, or I'm going to say object dot entries of our attributes. Okay, object dot entries. If we pass in an object, we're going to get back an iterable, where each iteration is going to give us back an array where the key is the first value and the value is the second value. And I'm destructuring it here using the destructuring syntax. If you haven't seen for of loops before, I have a video on the channel as well in the JavaScript series, and same with the destructuring syntax as well. So once we have that, what we want to do is actually set the key to be the attribute key, and then the value to be the attribute value. So I'm going to say p.setAttribute. I'm going to set the key, right, which is the first argument to set attribute, and I'm just going to set it to be the value, just like that, right? Now, this can technically be problematic, because in HTML, the kind of all the keys and the values need to be strings. All right. So if we were to pass an object in by accident as one of these values, like for example, this here instead of big was an object or an array or something, this wouldn't work as expected. Right? So we would want to really check for all those things to make sure it should get stringified, like JSON stringify, for example. But really you want to be careful to not actually set that, right? So we wouldn't want to end up in a situation where we're doing something like p.setAttribute, for example, like ID, and we wouldn't want to be setting it to be like, 1, 2, 3, because this doesn't really make sense, right? Because HTML doesn't support JavaScript as the attributes. We would only want to set it to be a string. So in this case, again, just for sake of simplicity, I'm going to assume that this function is being called correctly. But if we were to actually be defensive about this, we would want to really check to make sure that the actual attribute values and the keys technically do make sense. Okay, now that we have this, what we can say is after this loop, we can just return that p element, right? So what we can say is that this is going to create a p tag. It's going to actually add the text as the text that we pass in as an argument. And then it's going to loop through all the attributes inside of this object that gets passed in, right? Which is blank by default. So it's going to add nothing. And it's going to set the attributes to be that key to that value, right? So for example, ID of 1 or class of big. All right. Then we're going to return that p. So now I can actually use this function. So I'm going to say const, for example, I'm just going to get really creative with my names here. P1 is equal to create paragraph. I'm going to say, let's just call this paragraph 1. And I'm going to set the attributes here to be, you know what? I'll just set no attributes because I actually have this set to be nothing. Okay. I'm going to create 3 of these. Then I'm going to say P2 and P3. This is going to be paragraph 2. This is going to be paragraph 3. Paragraph 2, maybe I'll say I want to have an ID of 2. And then paragraph 3, maybe I want to have, maybe I'll say a custom attribute like data dash hello. And I want this to be like meow. Okay. I always mess up my stuff here. There we go. Data dash hello is meow. So this is a data set attribute, which is a custom attribute, which we could use for whatever we need, for example. In this case, it doesn't actually make sense because it's we're not using it for anything, but it's definitely something that we would definitely see in a real DOM if we were to actually have this custom attribute set up. Okay, so I could add many of these attributes because we're creating a loop, right? So if I added a whole bunch of keys and values into these, that would still work. But I want to really see what happens when I actually add these to the DOM. So just to really clarify, right? I've created my function. I've even created 3 paragraphs, right? If I open this in my browser, okay, and I super zoom in here, and I open my developer tools, what we'll see is that the DOM, apart from the script tag, right, is empty. There's nothing apart from the script tag in here yet, right? So we need to append these to the body. So I'm going to say document.body, and I can either prepend or append if I want to appear before or after the script tag. So for example, I can just do prepend just so you can see that it appears before the script tag. I'm going to do P1. And then if I keep doing prepend, I'm actually going to add these in kind of reverse order. So I'll show you what I mean. So if I do prepend P2 and then P3, it's going to have P3 first because that's the last thing that was prepended, just so that we can see how this looks differently. Okay, so if I switch back to my Chrome here and I refresh, I'd like you to see the kind of visual output here on the left, as well as actually what it looks like in the DOM over here. We would expect them to be prepended to the body as children, which is going to happen before the script tag. All right, so 1, 2, and 3. And there we go, paragraph 3, 2, and 1. And in the body here, if we actually take a look at that, right? We have our actual attributes, all the text content set up correctly as we would expect. Now that is pretty cool, right? We created a reusable function that allows us to kind of create these paragraphs quite easily, right? Now this is effectively just a small wrapper around the create element, but still quite useful, right? This might save us a bunch of code if we want to actually create these elements with the correct attributes and some text instead of having to do it kind of like this every single time. That's pretty awesome. I hope you found that one interesting. Let's take a look at exercise 3. Okay, now I want to warn you, this one is definitely the most challenging of the bunch. The previous ones were definitely challenging in their own way as well. I definitely amped it up a little bit for this one just to really start combining a bunch of different concepts together as well from just vanilla JavaScript as well. So for this one, same thing. I'd like you to create an HTML file with a head tag containing a title with some text and an empty body. Inside the body, have a script tag, and then we're going to add a bunch of code inside of it. So no differences there from the previous couple of exercises. Now here is where the differences arise. I want you to create an array, okay, a regular JavaScript array. And in this array, I want you to create 3 elements, right? So there's going to be 3 elements in this regular array. The first is going to be a p tag that has some text inside of it, or I should p kind of element node. The second one is going to be a div node that has a label and an input inside of it, nested inside the div. Okay. The third one is going to be a nav element that has a UL nested inside of it, an unordered list. And then that unordered list is going to have 3 li elements, so list items nested inside of itself, each with some text of your choosing. Okay, so this is kind of triple nested right here. This is one level of nesting, and this has no nesting. All right. Now where things get interesting is, I'd like you to use the setInterval function, which we looked at in the previous set of exercises as well. And if you're not sure about this one, definitely take a look at it on MDN. It should have a pretty good example of how it works. But effectively, this function takes a function as its first argument and a time in milliseconds as a second argument, and it will repeat the code inside that function every that amount of milliseconds. And what do we want to repeat? Well, we want to repeat randomly choosing an element from our array, right? So one of these 3, we want to randomly pick one out and then display it in the body of the DOM, right? So it's going to actually show up visually as well as in our elements tab of the DOM every 1 second. But the interesting thing is we want to make sure that these keep switching out. So every 1 second, we're going to remove everything that was in the body before and then replace it with one of these 3 randomly chosen. Okay. Now, to keep it simple, don't worry about duplicate choices. If you want to make it more tricky for yourself, you can make it so that if you, like try to choose a p tag twice in a row, for example, it doesn't let you do that. You have to pick a different one. But for this example, just focus on really kind of the rest of the logic before you try to get to that. Once you actually solve that, then you can try to add kind of the no duplication to see if you can get that working. So then what you want to do is open this up in your browser. Make sure that every second we're kind of getting a different one of these, minus the duplicates potentially, of course, where we're seeing kind of a p tag or our div tag or our nav showing up. Okay, and I want you to look at how that visually changes in the actual elements tab in the DOM, as well as visually in the actual UI of the browser itself. Now, before you get started on this, I just want to mention that there are several ways to empty out all the child nodes and elements out of a tag. Because I mentioned in this case, we want to take the body and we want to actually replace the body with one of these 3 tags. So everything inside the body, I should say, we want to replace, right? So a few different ways to do that. I would encourage you to not use inner HTML, although that is definitely one solution. There are a few other different solutions that you can look up. I encourage you to Google it or try to think about some solutions based on what we've seen so far together. So give that a shot, and then we will go through this together. All right, so to start, I'm going to create a new exercise-3.html file. And I'm going to copy, again, same thing here, probably my exercise 1, why not? And I'm going to get rid of everything inside of my script. And I'm going to change this to exercise 3. All right, now I'm going to go back to exercise3.js. I'm just going to copy this text right here, and I'm going to put it over here. And just put some comments on there just so that I can actually see this a little bit more clearly. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, we want to create these different elements and then put them in an array, right? So I'm actually going to create these elements first, and then I'm going to put them in an array right after. So I'm going to create the P first. I'm going to say const P is equal to document.createElement, and this is going to create a P element. Then I'm going to say p.textContent is equal to hello, I love monkeys, right? My favorite animal. Maybe I'll also add an emoji in there just for some visuals. There we go. Awesome. Then that's the P tag. Okay. Now we can add this to an array right now, but I'm going to actually save it to adding to an array right after we finish these other two tags as well. So I'm going to move on to the div tag next. I'm going to say const div is equal to document.createElement, and this is going to be our div tag. Now the div tag is going to have a label and an input inside of it. Okay, so we actually need to create those two as well. So I'm going to say const label is equal to document.createElement of the label. And then the same thing for const input is equal to document.createElement, and this is going to be an input tag. Okay, now let's just add some text to the label. For example, label.textContent is equal to I don't know, I'll just say like email or something like that. I should add probably a for field and a whole bunch of other fields or attributes, I should say, but I'll just keep it super simple for now. We'll see more of that when we look at forms later on, because that's going to get very important, as well as things like the name. But for now, I'll just keep it super simple so we don't have too much code at once on our screen. Then what I want to do is I want to say div.append. I want to append the label. And then I want to div.append, and I want to append the input. So we're going to see the label followed by the input right after it, which is what we'd expect. Now, again, there should be some for and name and things like that, but we'll ignore that for now. Okay, so that's the second one. Then we want our nav with our UL with our three LIs. So let's create those. So I'm going to say const. Let's do nav is equal to document.createElement, and then I'll do my nav. Then I'll say const ul equals document.createElement, and I'll say the ul. And then now things get kind of interesting. We intuitively should be able to create one LI, but each of these LIs is actually its own node because they each are going to have their own text and show up as different nodes in the DOM. So we actually need to create three different LI elements. Okay, because we can't just duplicate one 3 times, because it's going to be the same reference to the same element, where if we were to move it around, it wouldn't work as we would expect, and it would actually be referring to the same element 3 times. So let's create 3 of these. So I'm going to say const li, let's just go to li1 is document.createElement, and there are easier ways to do this, which we'll see in the future as well. I just want you to get an appreciation for how this might actually work. So I'm going to create li2 and li3. Okay, then I'm going to say, I'll just do this kind of in order here. I'll say li1.textContent is equal to, I think what did I have in here? I wanted it to be, did I say anything about this? No, I didn't. Let's just go with home. And then I'm going to say li2.textContent is equal to, let's go with blog, why not? And then li3.textContent, let's go with, I don't know, about. Let's go with that, why not? Great, so we have all these elements created, but they're not kind of nested correctly. These are all just regular elements just at the root level. So we want to start adding these to the actual nav. I'm going to keep adding this without any spacing, just so we can see that these are 3 separate blocks of code. If that bothers you, I'm sorry. Normally I would add more spacing in my code, but just for sake of organization, in this case visually as well, I'm just going to add this all together in one big block. So I'm going to say nav dot append, and really the order of this doesn't really matter too much, because these are all references and independent nodes that we can move around in different ways. So we just have to make sure we get the kind of sequencing of this correct when it comes to prepending and appending and before and after. But apart from that, it's not going to matter too much, maybe apart from the sequence that we add the LIs for that matter. So I'm going to append to the nav the UL, right? So the UL is going to be a child of the nav. Then I'm going to say UL, I'm going to start appending the li1 first, and I'm going to do this 3 times. Okay, so I'm going to say li2 and then li3. So So we're gonna, if we append instead of prepend, what we're gonna see is first is gonna be home, then it's gonna be blog, then it's gonna be about. And that's gonna be nested in the UL, which is itself nested inside of the nav, right? So that's this structure right here. All right, so this is our nav. This is our div with our input and label, and then this is our much simpler paragraph. Okay, now we want to add these to an array. So I'm going to say const elements is equal to an array. And what are the root of each of these three elements? Well, there's our p, there's our div, and then there's our nav, right? So I'm going to say p, div, and nav. Now, this looks really simple, right? But there's a lot happening in here. Remember, these are all trees of elements and nodes. The p tag is the simplest. It technically has only like a text node inside of it. The div has other elements inside of it, and the nav has many, many more elements inside of it. Each element can have further elements, as we've seen, or can have their own attributes and all sorts of other crazy stuff. So this is a very simple, kind of innocuous looking line, but there's a lot packed in here. Okay, so what do we want to do? Well, we want to now pick out one of these randomly every second. So I'm going to say setInterval, and I'm just going to code this myself, interval, and this is going to take a function. I'll just pass an arrow function and then a timeout. So 1000 milliseconds is 1 second. I want to create a random number that's 0, 1, or 2. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to say const random is equal to math.floor of math.random. It's a good one to kind of memorize a little bit, multiplied by, in this case, 3. But just to be a bit more like dynamic, I'm going to say elements.length. Right? Just so I can add more elements here later. I don't have to keep changing this function by hard coding a number in there. All right. So that's going to give us a random number. And then what I want to do is I want to clear out the body, and I want to add the random element to the body. So how do we clear out the body? Well, there's a few ways that we can do this, right? We can actually loop through, for example, all the children and remove them using .remove. We can set the inner HTML to be an empty string. We can set the text content to be an empty string. We can, I think there's other methods as well, actually, in the DOM API that we can probably look up, like replace or something like that, right? But, you know, what we choose here, it doesn't really matter. Some people are going to argue that some are more performant and some are, have some features that other ones don't. I'm just going to go with one example so I can show off remove as well, and we can get a better idea of some of the DOM methods, but by no means is this the only way. So what we want to do in this case is I'm going to say for const child of, and then I'm going to say document.body.child. Technically, I should say nodes, but I'll just say children for now because we only really care about the elements. So for each child of the body's children, so this is going to give us something that's array-like, but it's not actually an array, but we can use a for of loop on it because it's an iterable. All right. Then I want to just remove that from the DOM. And since we have each child is going to be an element, because this is a list of elements, we can just say child.remove. Okay. And since this is only going to give us the kind of the root level elements and all their siblings inside of the body, it's going to remove all their children immediately as well. So if this child has like 100 children inside of it, it's going to all get removed from the DOM tree because we're removing that entire root from the DOM. Okay. And if there's many, many children inside of the body, for example, like maybe a nav, and then maybe there's like some text and an article and a section and a footer, all of them would get removed. As long as they're all children directly descendant from the body. So this is going to remove everything from the body. Again, there's many other methods to do that. But if I want to add a random element to the body, what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to say document.body, and I'm going to just append. Well, what do I want to append? I want to append the element from this list of elements that's randomly chosen using this index, right? So I want to append the element from elements at the random index. Okay, technically I should have called this random index or something, but hopefully you can see that that makes sense. Now, that was a lot of code to write without actually testing it in the browser, but I'm pretty confident that that makes sense. And this is really where if you really think about things logically, most of the time it should work out minus a few potential bugs. So let's see if we have any bugs, because I actually didn't really practice this beforehand. I'm just kind of doing this on the fly myself as well. So I'm going to open this up in my browser. Fingers crossed it actually works. Now, since this set interval is set to trigger right away, what we expect to see is that we're going to see one of these three elements, right? Either the paragraph, the div with the label and the input, or this navbar with the UL and its list items, one at a time, switching out every 1 second. So let's see if we can get that working. So again, I'm going to open this up and double click. All right, and I see some things showing up in here. Let me super zoom in. All right, I'm going to open up my Elements tab. Looks like it's kind of working. Look at that. All right, there's our body. It looks like it's choosing the div a bunch of times. There's our P, there's our div, there's our P, there's our nav, right? That is pretty awesome, right? Every second, we are randomly choosing one, and you can see some of these are duplicates, right? Because we didn't actually check to see if we're choosing the same index 2 times in a row. I'll leave that as an exercise for you to figure out, just as a little extra bit of fun. But look at that, right? This is pretty amazing. We literally created an entire kind of like a component. If you think of things like React or Angular, any of these other frameworks, we can create these kind of components one at a time and actually just choose from them and insert them into the DOM, remove them from the DOM, manipulate them in the DOM if we want. When we get to things like event listeners and styling, we can even restyle them, add and remove styles. All that kind of stuff is at our disposal because the entirety of this DOM API is available to us and all the power that comes with it. This is super fun to put together. I really, really hope that you enjoyed these exercises. I know they are quite challenging, but that was kind of the point, to really get your mind, the wheels spinning and be like, wow, this is really a lot of power here, right? We saw how we can create a function, right? Hint, hint, I'd like you to think of something like React, if you used that before, that creates elements for us, right? Not too different from that framework. And once we look at future technologies that we're going to see in this series, like web components, that's going to become even more powerful and kind of consolidated. So I hope you found this video valuable. I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy it. In the next video, what we're going to do is we're going to go through styling together, as well as things like classes and the class list and removing and adding these classes, because up until now what we've seen is that we can add inline styling using the style tag, which is pretty good. Like, we can do a lot of things with that, but there's actually an easier way to actually change styling that's technically still inline and part of the DOM, but in a much easier syntax to understand, that will actually set us up really, really nicely for when we start packaging these components together to actually create these components, right? If you think of like React again, to pick on React, you generally want like a card component, right? Or a navbar component, and it's going to have all the flex and all the sizing in there from CSS. Not that I'm a CSS guru at all by any means, but it would be expected to have at least some styling in there, as beautiful as these vanilla DOM elements look. So I can't wait to get to that series of videos. I'll see you in those ones. See you later.